We're going to get started. Let me be the first to say good afternoon and thank you for being here. We're going to bring up Congressman Blumenauer in just a minute, but first I thought I'd give you a little background on who I am and why we're here and what brought us here. I'm Ryan Merkley. I'm the Director of Research Advocacy at the National Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And before the Congressman comes up, I'd just like to thank him and the other members of Congress who made today possible. Senator Ron Wyden, who could not be here because it's my understanding there's something going on with the Intelligence Committee today. No idea what that is. Congressman Buchanan, of course Congressman Blumenauer, and Congressman Buchanan and Blumenauer are, if you do not know, chairs of the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus, who are sponsoring and collaborating with us on this event. I'd like to thank them and thank all of their members. Without further ado, let's bring up Congressman Blumenauer.
Well, go ahead and have further ado. I will make a couple of brief comments just to make sure that anybody who's late has a chance to join us, because we've got an all-star panel on one of these third-tier issues that you're not going to hear about on Fox News or MSNBC. It's one of the rare areas where there are a significant amount of bipartisan agreement, and it matters to lots of people. You have a chance to get a sense of what difference it makes. You know, this data that people in the animal welfare space have relied upon for years to be able to track what's going on, be able to hold people accountable, understand that everybody's playing by the same rules, and those who aren't be able to do something about it. Having this data also, I think, is a tool for responsibility for the federal government itself. Sadly, for those of us who care deeply about animal welfare, the federal government has kind of a mixed record in terms of making sure the Animal Welfare Act is enforced. There are practices that the Animal Welfare Protection Caucus is trying to change in terms of how predator control, I mean, all sorts of things that the federal government is involved with, where there's push and pull with other conflicting interests who are pretty well established. And it leads to outcomes that are not necessarily beneficial for animal welfare. Making sure that people know what the conditions are, dealing with puppy mills, what's happening in research facilities. It's an important check to make sure there's a little gentle pressure on the federal government itself to lead up to our ideal. I'm convinced that animal welfare is what's going to get this Congress on track. You may have noticed there's a little bit of controversy back here. Not everybody agrees on everything. There's some partisan discord. Some of the stuff coming out of the White House leaves people scratching their heads. In fact, some of the people in the White House are scratching their heads trying to understand how all this stuff works. The consensus that we ought to do a better job of enacting animal protection legislation. And Congressman Buchanan and I had a little op-ed in one of the school papers here on Capitol Hill a couple of weeks ago of 10 items of legislation that are all teed up and ready to go, to be able to make further progress in something that really does tend to unite people rather than divide them. But the notion of transparency, I think, is an overused term. But this information has been collected by government agencies using taxpayer money, being able to understand and guide practices and decisions that matter. And the notion that somehow you're not going to get access to it without going through a complicated freedom of information process, which candidly could overwhelm the federal government itself in terms of having all sorts of requests that people have to jump through hoops to try and process. So it's self-defeating in a sense, and it doesn't give people the tools and the confidence to be able to make sure that our rules and regulations are enforced and that business competitors are behaving in a consistent fashion. I am cranky that I've got a Ways and Means hearing that I have to go off to on another one of these little non-controversial issues of the Affordable Care Act. But having an opportunity for you to be able to dig down, to be able to understand what's at stake, understand the nuances, and hopefully be part of an effort here where Congress will exercise its responsibilities on behalf of animal welfare and frankly for the public taxpayer. So thank you for being here. I know you all have other places to be, but this is important, and this is one of those areas where we have legislation that actually has bipartisan support, that actually is going to save the federal government money, not cost it money. And that with your help and the principles that you represent, we'll be able to move this across the finish line. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Congressman. And let me also point out that Senator Menendez and Congresswoman McSally have been real leaders on this issue as well. While not directly affiliated with today's event, they've shown a lot of courage on this issue, and the 5 members of Congress I've mentioned really show us that this is a bipartisan issue, as Congressman Buchenauer just told us. I'd like to tell you a little more about the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine, who I work for and have for the last 11 years, because some of you may not be as familiar with us as you are with some of the speakers' organizations today. We have 12,000 physician members. We have 150,000 members overall. We conduct clinical research. We also operate a healthcare clinic in the Friendship Heights neighborhood of DC, if you're looking for a primary care provider. But the work I do is our work to modernize and humanize research, testing, and training through the replacement of animal use. And in that work, over the last many years, we have used the Animal Care Information System, the database we are all here to discuss. This database was a website that was operated by USDA's Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, or APHIS, as many of you know it. And APHIS's job, among other things, is to enforce the Animal Welfare Act and the Horse Protection Act. And in the enforcement of those laws, they collect a lot of records, including inspection reports, annual reports, which show us which Animal Welfare Act covered facilities are using animals and how many every year, and other records. And these records went into the Animal Care Information System, where any citizen could go online and search for certain things. Now, while this database was useful for our work to see which research facilities were the most egregious offenders of the Animal Welfare Act and which ones were in compliance, it was also, as the Congressman mentioned, a good tool to figure out whether the USDA was actually enforcing the Animal Welfare Act. And if you look back a few years at the last audit by USDA's Inspector General of its oversight of animal research facilities, you'll find some reasons to be concerned about the agency's enforcement. For instance, USDA's OIG found that the agency had wasted resources by inspecting more than 100 facilities, more than 500 times over a 2-year span. And these facilities had not even housed animals, those 100 plus facilities, for more than 2 years. In addition, the agency failed to properly punish laboratories found in violation of the law by habitually reducing fines by up to 86%. And then lastly, the agency failed to conduct investigations into grave or repeat violations. So all of that, when you consider all of that, you have to wonder, isn't a database where you can track the USDA's actions as it pertains to the Animal Welfare Act a good thing? And in fact, a lot of us use the database in that way. And it's one of the reasons we were so stunned when earlier this year, the USDA decided to shut down public access to that database. On February 3rd of this year, USDA cut off public access and issued a statement that read in part, based on our commitment to being transparent, remaining responsive to our stakeholders' informational needs, and maintaining the privacy rights of individuals, we have cut off public access to the database. A very confusing statement, especially when you consider that privacy rights are already protected by an appeals process that exists within the USDA and has been in place for years. So it's important, as you hear from some of our speakers today, to keep this in mind, because protecting privacy rights, but also allowing public access to information are things that can go hand in hand, and for years already did. So the appeals process, if you are an Animal Welfare Act covered facility, means that if you are inspected by the USDA and a violation or non-compliance is found, You can discuss that with the inspector. You can also then file an appeal to the regional office within 21 days. Now, if an appeal is not filed, the records go online. But if one is filed, then until the appeal is settled, the records do not go online. And most importantly, personal information is redacted in those records that do go online. So, taking this into consideration, it was surprising when the database shut down. We're going to hear today from some really impressive speakers, and I'd like to tell you just a little more about them. First, you're going to hear from Delcy Anna Winders, academic fellow at the Harvard Animal Law and Policy Program. Then you're going to hear from Marty Irby, who is senior advisor at the Humane Society Legislative Fund. Then we're going to hear from Laura Hagan, who is at the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Then Kathy Liss, president of the Animal Welfare Institute. And then lastly but not leastly, Andrew Benobi, who is senior manager for federal legislation at the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, or ASPCA. I'm going to hand it over to Delcy, and we'll get this started. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you all so much for being here. I'm very impressed with the turnout. So as Ryan said, I'm the academic fellow in Harvard's Animal Law and Policy Program, and at Harvard, my research focuses specifically on the Federal Animal Welfare Act and enforcement failures under that act. So as you can imagine, I rely very heavily on the records that were deleted on February 3rd. As a result, my research has also increasingly taken a turn to focus on transparency issues. And before I came to Harvard, I practiced animal law for 10 years and very frequently practiced in the area of the Animal Welfare Act. So I have a lot of experience with the statute and with using these records, which were very valuable. What I'm going to focus on today is why the USDA, under the law as it stands today, is legally required to restore all of the records that have been deleted. And that is under the Freedom of Information Act. So most people think of the Freedom of Information Act as a statute that allows you to submit a request for particular information and get those records in response. But what's less known is that in 1996, Congress passed very important amendments to broaden the Freedom of Information Act. These are generally referred to as the eFOIA amendments. And among other things, they required that agencies proactively and affirmatively post records online before they ever receive a request for records. So the provision that's most important for us today is here, and it states, each agency shall make available for public inspection in an electronic format, and that has been made clear to mean the internet, all records that because of the nature of their subject matter, the agency determines have become or are likely to become the subject of subsequent requests for substantially the same records. Now, when Congress passed these amendments in 1996, they made very clear about what their purpose was. They said the purpose is to prompt agencies to make information available affirmatively on their own initiative in order to meet anticipated public demand for it. In other words, FOIA processes should not be encumbered by requests for routinely available records or information that can more efficiently be made available to the public through affirmative dissemination means. Again, the internet. The U.S. Department of Agriculture, in the context of the Animal Welfare Act, has repeatedly recognized the purpose and intent of these amendments. So for example, in a 2009 letter, the agency noted, the goal of the eFOIA is to make information publicly available online so that FOIA requests become an avenue of last resort. Importantly, the agency also acknowledged that Animal Welfare Act inspection reports had been the most frequently requested APHIS, that's the sub-agency that enforced the Animal Welfare Act, records under the FOIA. This means they were subject to the eFOIA's affirmative disclosure mandates. Even before that, in a 2004 memo, the USDA unequivocally stated, Animal Welfare Act inspection and annual reports qualify as records subject to multiple requests under eFOIA and must be made available to the public via electronic means. USDA has reiterated these obligations numerous times over the years, and in addition to acknowledging that eFOIA mandates that it post inspection and annual reports online, it's also noted that the same applies to enforcement records, which is the other category of records that were deleted on February 3rd, and notably the only category for which 0 records have been reposted to date. So for example, in a 2015 letter, the USDA said, enforcement records are frequently requested, and as a result, APHIS, in compliance with the Electronic Freedom of Information Act amendments of 1996, made the determination to provide the requested records on its agency website. Even today, checked this morning, the website that the records were deleted from still acknowledges that these records are posted pursuant to the FOIA. The records have simply been deleted. But despite these clear duties under the law, despite the USDA's repeated acknowledgement and compliance with these duties, thousands of records remain missing from the website. And as you can imagine, the impact on the agency's FOIA processes and backlog has been severe. So even before the website blackout, USDA and APHIS specifically had severe slowness in processing. I have numerous FOIA requests that have been pending for well over 2 years. But with the deletion of records, the situation has become much more dire. So according to communications I had with the agency just a couple weeks ago, since February 3rd, APHIS's FOIA backlog has almost doubled, and monthly FOIA requests, depending on the month, have increased from 87 to 300, by 87 to 371%. So in addition, I would like to, now that we have this very clear mandate to post these records, I want to turn to the privacy issues that the USDA has raised as a purported defense to deleting these records. So the USDA has vaguely asserted that there's some sort of privacy interest at stake. I should note first that we really don't know what they mean when they're asserting this. They haven't explained it anywhere. And in response, I submitted an expedited FOIA request on February 3rd, the day the records were deleted, to try and find out what was motivating this. And so far, all that I've gotten back are 1,700 pages that were completely blacked out. So we really don't know what they mean when they're talking about privacy interests. But regardless, there are a few things that are important to note. The first is that corporate entities, which many of the records pertain to, have no privacy interests under the law at all. There's not even an argument in support of that. And yet enforcement records for thousands of enforcement records for corporate entities remain missing from the website. And even when you're talking about individually or closely held businesses, the courts have recognized repeatedly that when you voluntarily choose to enter a commercial enterprise that's regulated, your privacy interests become de minimis. They're reduced, and they also have to be balanced against the public interest in disclosure, which in the context of the Animal Welfare Act is very high. In addition, as Ryan noted, the agency was already redacting any arguable privacy information from its website. So the privacy arguments are very flimsy. And regardless, I think most importantly, the eFOIA mandates aren't overridden when you have potentially exempt material. Rather, the agency has a duty to redact any material that it's exempt from disclosing and then post the record, which is exactly what it had been doing for many years. So just to sum up, the couple of quotes here, one is from our founding father, Thomas Paine, and one from the author of the book that became the basis of the Freedom of Information Act, which was passed in 1967. There is a very clear requirement under the law that the USDA repost all of these records, and every day that it fails to do so, it is in violation of the 1996 eFOIA amendments, and there is no privacy argument for continuing to withhold these records. Thank you.
I thank you all for attending today. A special thank you also to Congressman Blumenauer, Congressman Buchanan, Senator Wyden for pulling things together. This is such a great turnout. We have regular briefings for the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus, but thank you all for being here today because this is a tremendously important issue on so many fronts within the animal welfare movement. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit about the Horse Protection Act and how the records relate to horse soring. The Horse Protection Act was passed in 1970 to eliminate the practice of soring, which is the intentional infliction of pain to horses' feet to achieve an exaggerated gait called the big lick. We see this primarily in the Southeast in Tennessee and Kentucky, and to hopefully in the long term finally bring an end to soring, we have a piece of legislation known as the Prevent All Soring Tactics Act
that we're working to help pass. It has 243 co-sponsors in the House. But to help achieve that goal and to help protect the horses and keep the information out there, we need these records back on the USDA's website. According to the Washington Post, and I believe there's an article in the packet that you all have today, they believe that this leads back to an entity known as Contender Farms in Texas that has taken legal action in the past to help rescind mandatory penalties that the USDA tried to impose to help better protect horses. The individuals, Mike and Lee McGartland, who are the owners of Contender Farms, have been listed on the USDA's website in the past as having violations of the Horse Protection Act. And so this is really the only way that we have today to track the people who are allegedly violating the Horse Protection Act. There are a number of instances where horse trainers that are out there actually soring the horses on a day-to-day basis are violating the law repeatedly, sometimes week after week, month after month, year after year, because there are very few penalties. In Kentucky, for instance, I believe it's a $25 or $35 fine for soring a horse on the state level. Then this is the way to keep people accountable. So if someone is going out and they want to purchase a horse and find out whether the horse is being purchased from a trainer or an individual who is credible, they would have been able to go onto that website and been able to look to see if those trainers or owners had violations that were listed and how recent they were, how many frequent violations they had of the Horse Protection Act. So now we're in a situation where consumers out there today within the equine world and within the Tennessee walking horse world and many other gaited breeds are unable to know whether or not a trainer has violated the Horse Protection Act or allegedly violated it within recent months or years. In addition, they also would not be able to know now whether a horse itself that they may be purchasing had previous violations of the Horse Protection Act, because in many instances, horses' feet who have been scarred from the practice of soring are not allowed to show again. So they could potentially buy a horse that had damage done to its limbs, could potentially have put a horse in training with a trainer who violated the Horse Protection Act. And in addition to that, the owners who were listed on the website as owners that have violated the Horse Protection Act also many times sell horses over and over multiple times. And so it was really a system that was so great to help consumers and to help the horses and really to keep an eye on what was going on, hold people accountable, because otherwise there really was no way for folks to know who was violating the law. There were a lot of names that were on the website that were captured and I believe still maintained, but moving forward we have not had any new records that have been reposted related to the Horse Protection Act. Just yesterday we were on the National Mall in front of the USDA with Kate Merritt, who I'm sure there might be a few people in this room that watch House of Cards, presented a petition, a Care to petition with over 100,000 signatures to the Department of Agriculture, and Congressman Blumenauer was there along with Congresswoman McSally, who led, we thank them for the letter they led to President Trump on this issue requesting the data to be reinstated with 101 members of Congress. So there's a tremendous public outcry over this issue. It's one of the issues that I've probably seen more support for animal welfare than anything I've worked on in a long time, and we hope that you all will consider getting engaged, having your bosses, the members of Congress weigh in and also help to try to restore this data. I believe there's also a letter in the packet that you all have that's an appropriations letter that helps with many issues led by Senator Wyden from Oregon and Senator Kennedy from Louisiana. So if you wouldn't mind, please take a look at that, and we ask that you present that to your bosses and have them join on. I believe the deadline is June 15th, is that correct, to join on? And that's to the Appropriations Committee. So thank you all for being here today and really appreciate your time and efforts in helping.
Good afternoon. I would like to also extend my thanks to you all for being here today to talk about this important issue. My name is Lauren Hagan. I'm the Deputy Director of Advocacy for the Massachusetts Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. To give you a little context, because I'm sure many of you are not familiar with our organization, the MSPCA is a statewide animal protection organization based in Boston, Massachusetts. We are comprised of a humane law enforcement arm, an advocacy and legislative affairs department, as well as 3 animal shelters and 3 animal hospitals. We're the second oldest humane society in the United States. We were formed in 1868, and we currently care for tens of thousands of animals every year. We have 110,000 members in Massachusetts and across the country. Uniquely, the MSPCA has a 50-year history as it relates to the Animal Welfare Act. We advocated for passage of the law in the mid-1960s. This is a little archival photo of one of our past presidents with Lyndon Johnson at the signing of the act in August of 1966. And we were deeply involved with subsequent amendments to the law. It's important to note that the work of state-based humane societies and advocacy groups like the MSPCA is critical to ensure strong enforcement of the Animal Welfare Act. In fact, legislative history of the 1970 amendments shows that the members of Congress responsible for including animal exhibitions within the law spoke of how America had long depended on humane societies to bring the mistreatment of animals to light. They acknowledged that humane societies were the moving force behind the legislation. As a humane society, many facets of the MSPCA's work are intertwined with the Act. We use the reach of the federal law to protect animals within Massachusetts and well beyond our borders. Prior to the removal of the records from the USDA's website, the MSPCA regularly used the agency's records database in our work in advocacy, law enforcement, and direct animal care. For example, our humane law enforcement team responds statewide to animal cruelty complaints regarding USDA licensees, and they use the database records as part of their preliminary investigation. There's obviously an immediacy with responding to animal cruelty investigations, so engaging in the FOIA process to access the records has essentially rendered these records useless for this purpose. In another example, we are currently advocating for statewide legislation to address conditions in which animals are bred and raised in USDA licensed facilities. Key provisions of this bill prohibit breeders that have certain violations of the Animal Welfare Act from selling animals in our state. Other key provisions are aimed at consumer protection and require state pet stores to post USDA breeder information on the cages where the animals are kept to allow individuals to research the breeders prior to making the purchase. In essence, prior to the records removal, we built proposed state legislation around the idea that access to the records in the database would be ongoing, as required under the Freedom of Information Act. Now the online database has gone dark, and reliance on FOIA requests greatly reduces or virtually eliminates the intended impact of this legislation. But more broadly, it is timely access to the USDA enforcement and inspection records that has allowed us to demonstrate to lawmakers that Massachusetts pet stores sell animals from USDA licensed breeders that have violated the Animal Welfare Act, and that circuses frequenting our state have also violated this important law. For example, in Boston, we used the records while advocating for an ordinance that banned the sale of dogs and cats in pet shops. That ordinance was filed and it was signed into law 9 days later. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, scathing USDA inspection reports of a small animal dealer were critical in making the case for an ordinance banning pet sales. The reports were issued in January of 2016, and I used them in public testimony just a few months later and have continued to use them since that time. Last summer, with our help, Cape Cod residents used a 6-week-old USDA inspection record to advocate against allowing exhibitors that violated the Animal Welfare Act into their community. Just over a month before arriving in Cape Cod, the USDA inspection report identified that the exhibitor had not met the animal welfare and public safety standards required under the law. In each of these cases, the process moved faster than even an expedited FOIA request would accommodate. In these circumstances, lack of contemporaneous access to records via the database essentially equates to no access. State and city governments were designed to have more flexibility than our federal government and to be able to move more quickly and creatively in certain areas. Ongoing access to the USDA records allowed state and local legislators to fill this role effectively because it allowed them to make informed decisions. The records allowed decision makers to understand whether or not regulated entities were meeting the requirements of the federal law and whether or not local action was required. With the records now offline, these assessments can only be made after engaging in the FOIA request process, which, as Delcy described, is historically slow, and it's a process that can actually often outlast most state and local legislative making processes. The database not only helped us to execute our work, but it helped us to ensure that the Animal Welfare Act continues to have its intended impact. Immediate restoration of the records is necessary so that groups like the MSPCA can most effectively continue to do our work. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I'm going to touch on the status of records related to the use of animals in experimentation. Following the data scrubbed by USDA, the vast majority of annual reports and inspection reports for research facilities do appear to have been posted online. The recent postings by USDA, however, have failed to include inventories identifying the number of animals on the premises at the time of the inspections. We are told that this information will be available again, but who knows when and in what format. Other critical data that was pulled has not been reposted. And as you heard from Delcy, this includes these types of enforcement records. One being official warning letters, and those are warnings of an alleged violation of the Animal Welfare Act and a notice that USDA may seek civil or criminal penalties if the alleged violations continue. And these are very useful to have when they've been issued against licensees and registrants under the law. Stipulations, which are pre-litigation settlement agreements, where an alleged violator agrees to pay a specified amount and/or comply with non-monetary penalties. And a non-monetary penalty would be agreeing to, say, cancel your research registration or disperse the animals that you have on your premises. And that could be a way that you resolve the alleged violations. And finally, administrative complaints. And these are the first step in the adjudicatory administrative proceeding. The complaint identifies the alleged violator, the alleged violations, and seeks imposition of sanctions. Up until about a dozen or so years ago, USDA actually issued press releases when complaints were filed and other enforcement actions were taken against licensees and registrants. More recently, USDA has touted Animal Welfare Act and Horse Protection Act enforcement actions via announcements like this. The announcement contained links so that you could go to each individual enforcement action. They made it readily and easily available. And however, you'll note that perhaps that this announcement is dated from August of 2016, and is in fact the last one that has been posted. So I note that trouble was brewing in the previous administration also. Ironically, the announcement here includes the following from USDA, quote, as part of its effort to make its actions transparent and accessible to the public, APHIS is highlighting enforcement actions taken in response to violations of the Animal Welfare Act and Horse Protection Act, end quote. Why does getting this information matter? Well, here's an example. This is information on Santa Cruz Biotechnology, one of the nation's largest commercial suppliers of research antibodies. And it was notorious for its failure to comply with minimum requirements under the law. It was cited repeatedly for egregious violations of the Animal Welfare Act, including a chronic failure to provide goats with much needed veterinary care. In fact, it was cited for inadequate veterinary care on 9 separate inspections, all in 2012 alone. Further, an October 2012 USDA inspection report indicated that Santa Cruz knowingly made false statements to USDA inspectors. The staff repeatedly denied the existence of an entire production site, one that housed 841 goats, even when asked directly by the USDA veterinary inspectors. Thanks to these inventories, and you'll see those, well, probably too small for you, sorry. Bottom left-hand corner shows inventories that were identified on each of the inspections conducted at Santa Cruz. And through access to this information, we learned that more than 5,000 animals disappeared from the premises of Santa Cruz. And in May 2016, the case was settled with Santa Cruz agreeing to cancel its research registration, have its dealer license revoked, and pay a historic $3.5 million civil penalty. Up at the top here, we listed the repeated complaints that were filed against the facility. And then the column on the far right-hand side is all the media attention. Again, none of this information would be possible when the data is scrubbed. And currently for research facility, the complaints are no longer available. The extraordinary settlement that was reached could not have happened, would not be possible with access to all of these key enforcement documents. Media followed the issue because there was information that permitted us all to follow it. The humane organizations such as the Animal Welfare Institute and others here, and the media stories put spotlight on the facility and on USDA's handling of the case. In addition to the public outcry, various individual researchers around the globe vowed not to use Santa Cruz antibodies. And prestigious universities acknowledged that a supplier's animal welfare record must be a primary consideration. Your handouts in the packet include a science article by Meredith Wadman from May 24th, which includes an account of a dealer supplying animals for experimentation, Thomas D. Morris, Inc. The company was found to have violated the Animal Welfare Act and received a letter of warning. In a similar case, an Illinois breeder, Eugene Burkholder, doing business as Oak Hill Genetics, who supplies dogs and pigs for research, received a warning letter from USDA in October of 2015. Citing multiple instances of ill and injured animals, a pig with a bloody tail stump, mother pigs with leg injuries, including one that was lame, multiple piglets with facial injuries and open sores and thick brown crust on their faces, and abscesses on numerous animals, including one that had ruptured. In the warning letter Burkholder received from USDA, he was cited for his failure to provide adequate veterinary care. And that's over 6 separate inspections conducted in 2014 and 2015. He failed to observe the animals daily and assess their health and well-being. He failed to have direct and frequent communication with the attending veterinarian and to handle the animals so as not to cause trauma. Meantime, they're receiving federal funds for grants and research. They have direct government contracts with USDA's ARS, the Ag Research Service, with the National Institutes of Health, Department of Defense, and the VA. And since 2012, there have been, at least of those papers that are published online and which specifically mention where the animals are coming from, we've identified at least 30 papers that cite Oak Hill and Burkholder as a source of their animals. Research institutions using animals from this facility include Baylor, their medical center, Vanderbilt University, the Mayo Clinic, University of Pennsylvania, and Washington University School of Medicine. We have no idea if, following the letter of warning, what else has happened with these facilities. Their inspection reports are not available and no documentation regarding additional enforcement action. Meantime, they're receiving millions of dollars in government contracts and profiting by selling their animals to researchers around the country. Although federal agencies such as the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Food and Drug Administration routinely publish information about companies and individuals who are alleged to have violated the federal law, USDA continues to withhold information the public needs in order to hold both the department itself and research facilities, dealers, breeders, exhibitors, airlines, and the walking horse industry accountable. Transparency is vital. Thank you.
So good afternoon, excuse me, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Andrew Benovi, and I work on federal legislation for the ASPCA from our Washington, D.C. office. I'd like to thank the Congressional Animal Protection Caucus for putting this briefing together today, to PCRM for organizing, and for all of you for being here today, because I know there's a lot going on. So we've heard how this database removal has affected different parts of animal welfare. What I'm going to talk about today is how it affects public oversight of puppy mills. So what exactly is a puppy mill? Excuse me, I know I get that question a lot here on Capitol Hill. And there's no legal definition of what a puppy mill is, but the way the ASPCA defines it as a large-scale commercial dog breeding operation where profit is placed above the well-being of the animals. So it's not necessarily a particular number of animals. The ASPCA has seen deplorable conditions in operations that have 10 animals, and we've seen deplorable conditions in operations that have close to 1,000 animals. The thing that consistently happens in these dog breeding operations is that corners are cut, and when corners are cut, it is most likely at the expense of the welfare of the animal. And make no mistake, life inside of a puppy mill is extremely harsh for these animals. Often, animals are placed into wire cages for their entire lives. They're outside in the elements, exposed to heat, exposed to the cold, exposed to the snow, to the rain. They're not given socialization, they're not given veterinary care. It is definitely not the way our animals at home are treated, and it's definitely not the way we'd like to see animals treated when they're being bred. So this is a top priority for the ASPCA. The ASPCA works with law enforcement, our field investigations and response teams, works with law enforcement to investigate all types of animal cruelty, including puppy mills. We go in and we rescue animals. Our behavioral rehabilitation center takes in these animals that haven't been socialized, that need a little bit extra time, and work with them to get them ready to be adopted. And you may hear this a lot, that we can't rescue our way out of this problem, so it's important for us to pass strong laws and regulations to improve the standards of care for animals. That's where I come in. I work in the government relations department. It's also necessary to inform consumers on what they're seeing at pet stores and where those animals that are at pet stores come from. And that's where our NoPetStoresPuppies.com website comes from. It's run by our campaigns department. So it's this information here that is directly affected by USDA removing this database information, that it is now impossible for consumers to know where animals at pet stores are coming from and to know how those animals were treated. So we've heard a little bit about the Animal Welfare Act, and as many of us will say, it provides a bare minimum standards for the way animals in breeding operations are treated. So not all Animal Welfare Act licensees are puppy mills. We'll just say that right now. But these APHIS inspections and the inspection reports are what's used by consumers to know where animals are coming from. And this lack of access is directly affecting the oversight of these operations. So as we've heard, that there's been a fraction of information that has been reposted by USDA, and I'll say a fraction. So of the 1,500 or so breeders that are licensed under the AWA, USDA has posted inspection information for 21 of them. So that's less than 2%. And it's only the inspection information, and all the enforcement documents and the other information that we've heard about today hasn't been reposted yet. And instead of having this information directly and easily available on the website, USDA is telling folks to go through the FOIA process, and we've heard this is a long and burdensome process. Our organizations know how to do FOIA, and if you work in congressional offices, you probably get constituents calling you, asking you for help with FOIA requests because it is a particularly burdensome process to go through. We have waited up to a year or more to get this information from USDA, and that was before the database was removed. We've heard that USDA has had up to a 400% increase in the number of FOIA requests since removing this data. So for consumers at home, going through this process is particularly long, and the information that we were getting via FOIA is not complete. So I've got some information here that shows a inspection report that we received before this blackout and then afterwards. And you'll see that the information about the breeder name, the information about the dog that was in question here has been removed. So for consumers to get this information at home, after waiting a year and a half for this information, there's no way for them to connect an animal that they see in a pet store with the information that they've received or via FOIA. Frankly, this information is too little and too late. So the ASPCA is calling on USDA to quickly and swiftly restore this information. There was a recent survey that was done that 89% of respondents agree with us. They want this information restored. They want to be able to see this on the website. I know we and HSLF all delivered hundreds of thousands of signatures to USDA asking for this information to be restored. We're seeing some amazing congressional support here. We've had sign-on letters, we've seen legislation introduced, and we've seen requests for the appropriations process as well. We're glad to see this continued pressure by Congress. We're glad to see this continued pressure by the American public. When it comes down to it, and I'm wrapping up here, is Americans want animals to be treated humanely. They want the Animal Welfare Act to be enforced. And without this information on the website, without this information easily available, there's no way for knowing that the Animal Welfare Act is being carried out effectively. So thanks. Look forward to taking all your questions now. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, everybody. I'm also just going to point out one more time what Marty said. In your packets, there is a Dear Colleague letter for appropriations. If you think this is an important issue, your boss should sign on to that letter. There are more than 100 House and Senate members already signed. What? 184, way more than 100.
The House letter is over, but the deadline was back, last month, but the Senate letter is still going on. We have 25 senators so far.
Thank you.
And it's bipartisan.
All right. So we're going to take some questions now, and I'll direct them to you guys. You can use the microphones in front of you. If you have questions, just raise your hand high.
Beyond just the way you guys use the database and the way you guys described it, what do you see as the most important day-to-day use, more broadly, more commonly, outside of your specific interests?
So let me just repeat the question. You're asking what's the most important day-to-day use or purpose for the database?
Yeah, and then a little more beyond the way you guys use it academically and for issue advocacy.
Who wants to take that?
I can take a piece of it, sorry. Okay, I'll just talk loud. One other area that's really used quite a bit for research facilities is that they will look at the suppliers, those who they're purchasing animals from, and look to see what their record is. And we certainly want to be sure they're aware of any citations that are being found at the premises of those that they're seeking to do business with.
I'll add to that. Laura alluded to this, but Massachusetts is one of numerous jurisdictions that have incorporated Animal Welfare Act inspection report data into their laws. So when a state, and in some cases local government, is deciding whether you can sell dogs there, they rely on this information. So those laws have become virtually unenforceable without that info. In addition, the industry itself relies on these records. So I should note that numerous entities in the industry that are subject to these disclosures have come out against it. That includes the Association of Zoos and Aquariums, the largest accrediting body of zoos. Speaking of research, which is an animal research defending entity basically, and Petland, which is, I think, the largest reseller of pets in this country. And they've said that it's become very difficult for them to determine whether the breeders they buy from are complying with minimum standards now.
And I'll add to that that in March, Delcy and I spoke on a panel at an animal research oversight conference in March. And along with us was a representative from the National Association for Biomedical Research, which has a very pro-animal research view of this issue, and someone from the University of Wisconsin, which has a prominent primate research facility. And the woman who spoke from there wasn't, in fact, herself a primate researcher. Well, all four of us agreed that the database should be restored. So you see a lot of support for this across different issues, different backgrounds. All right, any more?
So my understanding is that some of the information was put back on the web. Can we use that same pressure to have created that, to get them to do the rest rest of it? In other words, when they first took it all off, there was obviously a lot of pressure, and they put some of it back on. Can we, basically, could we do that again to make them sort of do the rest, or maybe not, I don't know. I'm not sure what prompted them to put the additional information back on.
Anyone volunteers?
And pressure, I'm sorry, go.
No,
Oh, pressure certainly would help. I will say, at a stakeholder meeting a couple weeks ago, the agency said it doesn't know when, if ever, it will repost the missing information. So my impression is that they've reposted what they think they can repost, and there is no telling when, if ever, other things will be reposted.
Right, and that the information that has been posted is very incomplete. As I mentioned, something like 2%, and that's just of inspection records, not including any of the enforcement information or the annual reports. So I wouldn't take that as a victory at all. I think.
I wasn't speaking as
right.
victory, I was just saying whatever forced them to do that, I was hoping we could do it again.
It may take that public support, or it may take, say, an act of Congress to get that back up.
One more reason for this, signing on to this letter.
Part of it may also relate to the fact that principally it's for research facilities, and the other entities that are covered under the law tend to be smaller businesses that are somehow being viewed under this bizarre interpretation of individual privacy.
Can I just note that on the appropriations front, though the House letter is finished, the effort obviously is still ahead of us, and 184 representatives joined on the effort. We have 25 senators pending, and more. It's calling for language that would direct USDA to repost this information. So that is really the best way that your offices for the short term can help. And the member requests were due right in the House, going to the chairman, Chairman Adderholt, and urging that we put that language in. It's very simple, one sentence, directing USDA to repost the information.
Thanks. Okay, we've got time for one or two more questions.
So, as far as the solution goes, would you say just like what she was talking about, directing the language to force the USDA to revamp the database, or is there any other solutions you can see in the foreseeable future?
So who wants to answer, but first I want to say something.
Why don't you say something?
Okay, I'll say it first. Okay. I'll say that I think, so we're here on Capitol Hill, so obviously we're talking about mechanisms that involve Congress. I think that you can look back through February and see a lot of media coverage on this issue, a lot of public concern about it. All the people here have played a role in that, and I think that certainly, that speaks for some of the progress we've seen over the last few months. Does anyone want to speak to other mechanisms on Capitol Hill that we could use?
Well, I'll say the appropriations process is probably a one that's very obvious. The ASPCA supports including that language into an agricultural appropriations bill. 171 folks signed on to that letter as well. There's also legislation that was introduced in both chambers that would force USDA to do this as well. So there's a few mechanisms, and I know you said we're here on Capitol Hill, and for Congress, if the only thing in your toolbox is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so here in Congress, we pass legislation and get that done. So both in the appropriations process, but also authorizing bills as well, could force USDA to have this information available. And USDA should go ahead and do it themselves, but if the agency is dragging its feet, then that's where Congress comes in and tells them to do what should be our duty.
And it wouldn't hurt if bosses wish to request a meeting directly with the secretary and put pressure in that way.
Okay, one more question.
Just to draw out the privacy argument a little bit, that, in America, we do have police arrest reports are public. Restaurants, food safety, code violations are posted publicly. And as was explained already, there was an appeal process to protect the entities, but the idea that somehow, and it's why the responsible actors, the organizations that Delcy mentioned, have rallied here to say we need this information back up, because for them it helps them establish public trust. It's the perpetrators don't want this information coming out, the horse stewards and the puppy mill operators, they don't want their names known to the public, but that's just not the way it works here, you know, if you're cited for a violation, and it's, that process, you have the opportunity to appeal it and keep it from being public and challenge it, but if it's, you know, if it's out there, it needs to be available to the public in an accessible way.
Okay, still time for one question. There we go. Sorry, who's? Okay.
Great.
Sorry.
How do you appeal to members of Congress that are apathetic to protecting animals and frame this legislation in a way that makes them want to sponsor this policy?
I would add, just as I said earlier, consumer protection is a huge thing, because whether or not they're interested in the animal welfare aspect of it, the negative financial ramifications to those who are purchasing animals could be tremendous, from veterinary bills to transportation costs, all sorts of things. So I think that would be a very important way to address it.
And also,
And accountability in grants that are given out to research entities, for example.
I mean, these inspections are paid for through tax dollars, so in order to have any accountability of how these tax dollars are being spent, we need to have public access to know what's going on. It's a transparency issue, it's a good governance issue, and it's definitely a financial issue as well.
And, sorry, if I could add one more point, I think it also helps USDA better enforce the law, that if that material is available, that serves as a strong incentive to comply.
And, I'm sorry.
No, go.
I can speak what's been effective at the state level, especially as it relates to animal exhibitors, is public safety. We're talking about, in terms of those provisions, large, captive, wild, dangerous, exotic animals. And there are live issues that go on that these records either show that there have been instances where these animals have been a real risk to the public.
Yeah, I just want to underscore that there are serious public health and safety risks that are also regulated by the Animal Welfare Act. So elephants with tuberculosis is an issue. Monkeys with fatal herpes virus are very commonly exhibited. And it used to be if a circus was coming to town, you could look up and see, you know, has this circus had a tiger kill someone or an elephant with tuberculosis? And you can't anymore. And also the taxpayer accountability issue is huge. This is a law that has never been properly enforced in all of its 50 years. And the Office of Inspector General for the USDA itself has said that over and over and over again. And now we have no accountability at all.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming.